Ajelina Lewis started life with lots of advantages.
Father is a psychologist.
She was an incredibly smart girl.
But then, when Ajelina was in high school, her life changed forever.
She got pregnant.
Ajelina and the baby's father, Will Palmer, did their best.
They were really trying.
She did everything in the world for her daughter.
But then, a mysterious crime
Someone went in the room and I ran.
ended Will's life.
He'd been stabbed repeatedly.
He is actually covered in blood.
But was Ajelina merely a witness?
There was a shadowy figure.
I didn't see their face.
Was she a target?
Someone's after me. There's rumors going around that I snitched.
Or was she really a killer?
She says, if the cops find this, I'm in so much trouble.
Sierra Vista, Arizona, March 12, 2010. It was early on a quiet Friday morning in the city of 45,000, an hour southeast of Tucson.
We're a stone's throw from the border with Mexico.
And at around 5:20, so early that the sun had yet to rise above the mountains that give the city its name, a confused call came into the Sierra Vista 911 center.
What is your emergency? Yeah, something happened. I don't know what.
All that the caller, 20-year-old Ajelina Lewis, knew for certain was that there had been a break-in.
Someone went into the apartment that I was staying at.
According to Ajelina, the apartment where the break-in occurred belonged to a man named Will Palmer.
It's my baby's daddy's apartment. I was staying with him.
And when the intruder came in, Ajelina said she had fled in a panic.
I just ran to the nearest phone.
And in her haste to leave, Ajelina said she had left Will asleep in the apartment.
I don't know if he's okay. All I know is that someone went in the room and I ran. And now I'm at the nearest phone that I could get to.
Unsure of the situation, the dispatcher asked her to meet the police back at the apartment.
I'll send the officers that way.
But when they knocked on the door, the person that answered wasn't Ajelina or Will. It was Will's uncle Ralph, who also lived in the apartment.
It appeared that he had just recently woken up.
And according to what Ajelina had just reported, Ralph didn't appear to know anything about an intruder.
They ask him, is anybody that's not supposed to be here? Who all is in the apartment? He says, well, just my nephew, Will.
The police say they're responding to a 911 call reporting some kind of disturbance. They're let inside.
Still confused, Ralph led the police to Will's bedroom.
The uncle goes back and opens the bedroom door.
And when he turned on the light,
he sees his nephew's body naked and bloody on the floor.
He'd been stabbed repeatedly.
Will's uncle goes over to him right away, kneels down, and he says he's cold.
Asked what happened, Will's uncle said he had no idea who had killed his nephew.
Could it have been some unknown intruder? Maybe.
And if that was true, the only witness who could identify Will's killer was the frightened young woman who'd called 911. Born in 1990, Ajelina Lewis had grown up in Sierra Vista in a typical middle-class family.
Father is a psychologist.
He's not extremely wealthy, but he doesn't have to, pinch pennies. Her and her brother did get a lot of what they wanted,
including after-school activities like the martial arts training Ajelina excelled at from an early age.
It was called Tang Soo Do, and she achieved a black belt.
In fact, by the time she was a teen,
Ajelina was actually one of the instructors.
She did well in school, too.
She was incredibly smart. She was an incredibly smart girl.
She was helpful to other people. She was a good kid. She did a lot of things in the community.
However, her carefree childhood came to an abrupt end in 2007 during her senior year of high school.
She got pregnant.
The father was her high school boyfriend, William Palmer. A year older than Ajelina, Will Palmer was a pretty typical teenager.
He liked being in the marching band and doing auto shop.
People just knew him as Will, well-liked by everyone.
Including Ajelina.
He is 15, 16 when they first meet.
And Ajelina was only 17 when she got pregnant.
She dropped out of high school.
That would have been going into her senior year.
Not that dropping out had been the plan.
She ended up quitting because she did have a lot of problems with her pregnancy.
The baby, a little girl, was born in 2008. And with the support of Ajelina's father, the new parents settled down to raise their daughter.
AJ's dad at this point had helped her to get a trailer and a piece of property out on one of the highways here, and they were both living there.
Will, who graduated the year before, got a job.
He just was working and trying to help support her.
He was a delivery driver for Pizza Hut.
He was hoping to later go back to school.
And while Will delivered pizzas, Ajelina took care of the baby.
She was a great mom. You know, she did everything in the world for her daughter.
They were really trying. They really were. I mean, both of them.
But they were still two teenagers trying to raise a baby.
That's just not something they were ready for.
The new responsibilities began to wear on Ajelina.
There's a whole lot of things going on in her life that she was still prepared to deal with.
Will also had problems adjusting to his new life.
He had to be around her 24/7, couldn't do things with his friends.
And when he could get away?
He had his own issues, as most young kids do. Probably drank a little too much, and at some point had some involvement in drugs.
William had his moments where you just wanted to strangle him. I mean, he was a kid.
So was Ajelina, and it showed in the relationship between the two teens.
They kind of had really what you'd think of as a juvenile relationship with each other. A lot of silly fights over nothing.
They were kind of off again, on again for a while.
And finally, not long after their little girl turned 1, they seemed more off than on.
He moved back home with us, and she had stopped by one day and dropped off 3 or 4 garbage bags full of his stuff in it. Told us, just keep it.
Will still helped support their child, but he wasn't moving back in with Ajelina.
He and his uncle had begun sharing an apartment.
Ajelina moved on too. She got a job and started working on her GED.
She was working at a little German cafe here in town.
My wife and I would babysit while she was taking classes at the college.
And by 2010, just as she was about to turn 20, it looked as if Ajelina had put the missteps of her teenage years behind her.
She's making her own efforts to do well in life and trying to move forward.
But then, on February 12, 2010, Ajelina's move toward maturity and stability took a huge step backwards. It all started when Ajelina got pulled over for a minor traffic violation.
The officer initiated his lights to perform the traffic stop. Items started getting thrown out of the window.
And when the cops searched the car, they discovered why Ajelina had been so desperate to get rid of those items.
She got busted for selling drugs.
They located a relatively large amount of cocaine, way too large to be personal use.
She was charged with possession with the intent to distribute.
Ajelina's father bailed her out of jail and hired an attorney.
We had information coming in about essentially what a good, though apparently troubled kid she was, that she's on track, except she needed this extra money because she's trying to raise her young daughter.
While the argument might sound persuasive, unfortunately for Ajelina, the law gave little leeway to the judge.
The amount of cocaine she had was over a statutory threshold.
It's mandatory prison time.
But there was even worse coming. Within a month of her arrest while she was out on bond awaiting trial, the police would be wondering, in addition to costing her prison time, would Ajelina's desperate attempt to provide for her daughter also cost Will his life? Coming up, Ajelina reveals a possible motive.
I've heard rumors that someone was after me, that I had snitched.
And the investigators find a puzzling clue.
There were no obvious signs of forced entry.
It was before dawn on the morning of March 12, 2010, when Ajelina Lewis called police in Sierra Vista, Arizona, to report an intruder at the apartment of her former boyfriend.
I don't know if he's okay. All I know is that someone went in the room and I ran, and now I'm at the nearest phone that I could get to.
She's indicating that she's not at this residence, but someone came into the residence, and she doesn't know what's going on.
And when the police arrived at the apartment, they found 21-year-old William Palmer sprawled on his bedroom floor.
He is actually covered in blood. He wasn't wearing any clothing, and you can see that there are multiple stab wounds across his body.
It appeared that he had been killed in his sleep.
He had been stabbed actually up on the bed. You could see the 2 stab wounds in the sheets.
But what had become of the mysterious intruder? William's uncle, who also lived in the apartment, said he hadn't seen him or heard the murder occur.
The officers, it was real clear that they had woken up the uncle.
Which meant that the key to the investigation would be the one person in the apartment who had been awake, Ajelina.
After she makes the 911 call, Ajelina returns to the apartment.
And when the police met her in the parking lot, she appeared to be anxious for news.
She inquires about Ralph. She inquires about Will, how he is, how he's doing, if anything's happened.
Her concerns seemed genuine. And considering she was barefoot, her story about fleeing in haste rang true, too.
She asked a number of times, "Can I go in and get my shoes?"
Still, the police wouldn't let her go inside or even tell her that Will Palmer was dead.
She was actually pretty upset with the officers that they won't tell her what's going on.
Instead, the officers put her in the back of a police cruiser.
She's taken to the Sierra Vista Police Department.
She's not in custody. She's just being brought over there so detectives can interview her.
And when she reached the police department, Ajelina was relieved to discover a familiar face, Lieutenant Jim Adams.
She knows him personally.
I met Ajelina when she was going to Tuxedo. She went with my stepson.
When she gets to PD, it just happens that Lieutenant Adams has come in pretty near the time when she's walked in.
I see one of our officers leading somebody into the interview room, and I didn't see who the person was and didn't really pay any attention to it until apparently Ajelina heard my voice.
And when she did, Ajelina rushed to embrace the lieutenant.
She's upset about something. She was crying. My first thought was that she'd gotten in trouble with drugs.
But the lieutenant quickly surmised that the problem wasn't another drug arrest.
She starts saying, "What happened to Will? What happened to Will?" At this point, I didn't know what had happened to Will.
And when the investigator escorting Ajelina told Adams what had happened,
he sits down with her in an interview room.
I went in there to basically take what I believed was going to be a witness statement. And she starts telling me the story.
However, Ajelina's statement didn't start with what happened that night. Instead, it began a month earlier when she'd been arrested for selling drugs. According to Ajelina, while her father had bailed her out of jail, the word on the street was that she had gotten out for a different reason.
I had heard it from Will, and he had heard it from people that I had snitched.
And she said those rumors had apparently made someone angry.
I've heard rumors that someone was after me.
She certainly sounded like a frightened young lady.
In fact, Ajelina said she had reason to be worried. She told the detective that someone had broken into her apartment a few days before Will's murder.
All that they had done, they had tossed the house.
Only her recent arrest documents had been taken, and Ajelina believed that whoever had done it had been trying to send her a message.
She said that she found a picture of her and her daughter that was torn in half.
She'd claimed that one of the reasons why she was at Will's place was that she was afraid to stay at her home.
Stayed at his house figuring it'd be safe.
And as an extra precaution, Ajelina had left her daughter with the little girl's grandmother.
They were going to bring her there tomorrow.
But that night, Ajelina said she'd spent the evening hanging out with Will and his uncle.
They were all just kind of kicking it, drinking a few beers, having shots.
Eventually, Will's uncle had turned in, and Ajelina had ended up in Will's bedroom.
Do you and Will still have relations, sexual relations?
She's kind of embarrassed, but admits that, well, we tried, but he couldn't because he was too drunk.
And then I was like, well, let's just go to sleep.
And then, early in the morning, as Ajelina lay in bed half asleep,
she became aware that there was a shadowy figure near the door.
I didn't see their face.
all she could tell in the dark room was that it was a man wearing what looked like a baseball cap.
Did he say anything to you?
Just quiet.
Did you say anything to him? Did you
No,
scream?
I just ran.
She repeated that several times. I ran, I just ran, I ran.
She says she fled, that she was frightened and fled.
Did you wake up Will?
No, I didn't know what to do.
Ajelina said all she did was grab a shirt off the back of a chair as she ran out the door.
What did you have on when you actually ran out the door?
My pants, and I was putting my shirt on while I was running out, but I didn't get my shoes.
And she neglected to grab her phone, too.
She tells Detective Adams that, well, my cell phone is still in the apartment.
But according to Ajelina, she did have her car keys.
She takes her car and drives to a house where some friends are staying.
Ajelina said she'd borrowed the friend's phone to call 911 and then had gone back to Will's apartment.
I came back. They were like, there's cops there.
Cops who refused to tell her what had become of Will.
I just want to know what's happening. I want to go see if Will's at the hospital.
Lieutenant Adams told Ajelina he'd let her know Will's condition once he'd heard.
He, at this point, didn't know of Will Palmer's death.
And then Adams gave her a hug, which is when he noticed something odd.
He noticed her hair was damp.
And why would her hair be damp? The lieutenant could think of only one explanation.
Maybe she had showered.
But why would she take a shower? Hoping his gut feeling was wrong, that the girl he'd babysat for wasn't trying to hide something about the attack on her ex-boyfriend. The lieutenant drove to Will's apartment, where forensic techs had just started going over the crime scene.
I started getting apprised as to what had occurred. I went in, I assisted with the search.
And right away, his worst fears appeared to be confirmed.
We started seeing some things that didn't look right.
There were no obvious signs of forced entry.
There was no indication that the alleged intruder had taken anything either.
Nothing was missing. Home computer and his laptop, cameras.
And then, in the bathroom off Will's bedroom, the investigators found something else.
Some socks in a hamper that appear to have some blood on them.
Little ankle socks.
And since Ajelina had been barefoot when she returned to Will's apartment, the investigators had a pretty good idea whose socks they were. Coming up, after a friend of Ajelina provides a crucial clue.
She tells him, if the cops find this, I'm in so much trouble.
The investigators turn up the heat.
I never said that.
Early on the morning of March 12, 2010, 20-year-old Ajelina Lewis had called 911 and reported that an intruder had just broken into the apartment her ex-boyfriend shared with his uncle.
She doesn't get a good look at them, but just gets up and runs.
She goes to this friend's house where she makes this call to law enforcement.
And when the Sierra Vista, Arizona police arrived at the apartment, they found Ajelina's ex, 21-year-old Will Palmer, dead in his bedroom.
He'd been stabbed repeatedly, and that's a very personal crime.
And the investigators were starting to suspect that the person who'd repeatedly stabbed Will was Ajelina.
Law enforcement and the county attorney's office believed that she was the most likely suspect.
First, the investigators had noticed that Ajelina's hair had been damp when she returned to the scene after calling 911.
Suggesting, of course, that she had showered.
Not something that you would typically do when you leave this scene and make a call to law enforcement.
In fact, the investigators could think of only one reason for Ajelina to take a shower.
To get rid of any evidence of having been involved in the stabbing.
Ajelina had also been barefoot when she returned to the crime scene. And while that had initially lent credence to her claim that she'd fled in a panic, that changed when the investigators found a pair of bloody socks buried in a laundry hamper not far from Will's body.
Somebody stepped in blood, took the socks off, put them in the hamper before they left the apartment.
And finally, there was the statement from the other person who'd been in the apartment when the stabbing occurred, Will's Uncle Ralph. Will's uncle claimed he'd been sleeping during the murder, but the investigators hadn't initially ruled him out as a suspect.
Could it have been Ralph?
Although when questioned that morning by the investigators, his account of what had happened at the apartment matched Ajelina's, at least in the beginning.
William, Ajelina, and my brother Ralph were all just kind of kicking it, drinking a few beers, having shots.
But later, as he was going to bed,
Ralph heard what he believed was Ajelina snorting cocaine in the bathroom.
well aware of Ajelina's history and the trouble her drug use had already caused, Ralph said he had immediately told his nephew.
And when Ajelina comes out, Will and Ajelina get into kind of a heated argument.
Will's uncle was a little vague on the details of the argument, though. He told the investigators that he'd gone to bed rather than stick around for the fight.
He goes, they started arguing, and I left.
Ralph couldn't actually tell what was going on.
However, he did hear one thing his nephew said.
At one point during that argument, Ralph Palmer hears Will tell Ajelina that he is going to take custody of their daughter.
Will told her, "I'm going to call the police and you're never going to see her again."
And with Ajelina already out on bond, awaiting trial on a possession charge, the investigators figured that she had taken Will's threat seriously.
She's already on prison mandatory charges, facing a decent amount of time, and then she's caught using that night.
And if Will did turn her in, that could add a considerable amount of prison time to what she was already facing, enough that she might not get out until her daughter was grown.
Now there's a potential that she may lose her daughter.
It sure sounded like a motive for murder, but according to Will's uncle, nothing happened. At least, not then.
And apparently they calm down, they make up.
Or had it just appeared that way to Ralph and Will? A false impression that would eventually cost Will his life.
At some point, she just decided she wouldn't be in prison while Will got to raise their daughter.
I think that was the catalyst, fueled by the drug and alcohol abuse and maybe some emotional instability.
It was more than just a hunch, too. While processing the crime scene, the investigators impounded Ajelina's car, still parked outside Will's apartment.
We looked in the car and there appeared to be a spot of blood on the center console.
So while the car was towed to the crime lab so the blood could be analyzed, the investigators drove out to the house where Ajelina said she'd gone in order to call 911, a curiously long drive.
It's about 6 miles between where she called 911 from and the apartment itself.
6 miles she didn't need to drive.
She drove past the phone on the way there at the gas station. She drove past the turnoff for her father's house.
And even more damning, according to Ajelina's friend, she had a phone with her that night, too.
She apparently hid her own cell phone between his mattress.
She tells him, if the cops find this, I'm in so much trouble.
According to her friend, Ajelina hadn't told him why she'd be in trouble if the police found her phone. But he wasn't the only person who'd been in the house when Ajelina came storming in, obviously upset.
There were several people there asleep in the living room, bedrooms, on couches. She bursts in, frantic.
She's talking about someone having killed Will.
It was a very different statement from what she later told the police.
She knew exactly what happened. Someone stabbed him to death.
And based on something else she allegedly said, Ajelina knew who had done it, too.
She makes a comment at some point, "I'm going to jail for murder."
From her friend's house, the investigators returned to the police station, where Ajelina was still waiting anxiously.
One day I had to find out what happened to Will and see okay.
He's saying, look, we're going to get to that, but I need to clarify some other things.
Starting with how she just happened to have her car keys when she fled the apartment.
I had my pants on.
Okay.
So they were in my pocket.
Those the pants that you got on now, right? Okay.
And the fact that she'd driven past a payphone and her father's house on the way to the friend's house where she phoned 911.
She says, it's just the safest place I could think of.
Not that she was thinking clearly, Ajelina admitted.
I was freaking out.
And the accusation that she'd been doing drugs that evening, Ajelina initially denied that.
Whatever sniffing sounds that Ralph Palmer may have heard, she attributes to allergies.
He thought I was doing coke.
But then, when the investigators pushed her,
We're going to take a blood sample today, and there's probably a pretty good chance there's going to be cocaine in your system.
Ajelina suddenly changed her story.
I'm just trying to swallow.
Okay. But see, you need to say that because what you said before wasn't true. See what I'm saying? And it's important because if it looks like you've been lying.
The fact that she'd been snorting cocaine the night of the murder wasn't the only part of Ajelina's story that changed either. When the investigators confronted her with what her friend had said about the phone she'd hid in his mattress.
Let me ask you this, did you leave a phone over there?
Ajelina admitted that was true too.
She says that phone had a bunch of drug stuff on it, and that's why she hid it.
Between her drug use and hiding the phone, the investigators had wrung a couple of important admissions from Ajelina. But could they get her to confess to the murder?
There is no easy way to tell you what happened to Will. He was killed. Okay.
She kind of leans her head down and takes a few breaths.
How was he killed?
He was stabbed. And there's a problem with that.
At that point, the investigators told her to stop pretending. That according to the people at the house she'd fled to, she already knew what had happened to Will.
Confronting her with the fact that they say you walked in and started talking about stabbing and murder and Will being dead.
Ajelina said her friends were wrong.
I never said that.
And all but accused of murder by the investigators, Ajelina stuck to her story that she'd fled from the apartment before anything happened to Will.
Will's blood wouldn't be in your car then?
No.
Did you stab Will?
No.
Instead of the killer, Ajelina continued to speculate that she had been the killer's target.
Someone's after me.
Somebody's after you?
There's rumors going around that I snitched.
Was it possible that Ajelina was telling the truth? That it should have been her stabbed to death in Will's apartment that night? The investigators didn't think so.
They came to hurt her. Why did they kill him? That part of the story didn't make sense.
And that was far from the only part either.
The bloody socks in the hamper didn't make sense. The keys didn't make sense. The phone. Why drive past the phone, past the turnoff for your father's house and ditch a phone when you had it the whole time and could have called police? The wet hair, it all started to kind of come together on our end and fall apart on hers.
The investigators didn't believe her, but that didn't mean they were ready to arrest her just yet.
A decision is made that they want to hold off, they want to be careful.
So at the conclusion of Ajelina's second interview, the investigators allowed her to go home after she changed her clothes.
The clothes that Ajelina was wearing were taken for evidence.
And once they were, the investigators discovered yet another hole in her story. Ajelina's claim that her car keys had been in her pocket when she fled the apartment.
Her pants didn't have any pockets.
And a few days later, when the preliminary results came back from the crime lab on the suspicious red stain found in Ajelina's car,
they confirm that it is blood.
Just whose blood? The test didn't say yet, but the results were enough for the police. On March 17th, 5 days after William Palmer was killed, the police asked Ajelina to come back to the station.
They asked her again if she'd mind answering some more questions. At that point, she invokes her rights. She's completely entitled to do so.
Not that it did Ajelina much good, because as soon as she said it, the investigators put her in handcuffs.
She asks, what am I being arrested for? They say, well, first-degree murder.
Coming up, at trial, the prosecution reveals stunning new evidence against Ajelina.
That just showed vengeance.
But the defense has some surprising evidence of its own.
It's an impression on the floor in blood. It looks like a large boot.
On May 9th, 2011, Ajelina Lewis went on trial at the Cochise County Courthouse in Sierra Vista, Arizona. The 21-year-old single mother was charged with murdering her ex-boyfriend, William Palmer.
Here you have this young woman who is accused of stabbing to death the father of her child while he slept.
She'd been in jail since her arrest the year before, and not just because she was awaiting trial for first-degree murder. She'd also been serving time for the drug-dealing charges that were already hanging over her when Will Palmer was killed.
She pled guilty to the drug charges and was sentenced to 2.25 years.
In his opening statement, the prosecutor told the jury it was Ajelina's involvement with drugs that had triggered the murder.
She had an argument the night before with the father of her baby, that the argument was over drug use.
That leads to a threat from Will that he's going to take their daughter away from her. And the prosecution argues that this basically sets her off.
Not that Will knew that, according to the prosecutor. He told the jury that Ajelina's intoxicated ex-boyfriend had no idea what was coming when he tumbled into bed with her just hours before his murder.
Exactly how and when she decided to stab him, I don't know. But obviously, she was real angry.
She wasn't sleeping. She was just thinking about what the morning was going to bring to her.
And at some point before dawn,
she decides to take matters into her own hands.
The medical examiner testified that the attack had been vicious.
It was more than 25 injuries, and they were both stab wounds and cuts.
Or in a word, overkill.
There were 3 or 4 actually fatal wounds. She managed to get his heart, his lung, on both sides of his neck.
Some of the photos were quite gruesome.
And while they were tough for Will's family to take,
what really affected me was seeing the pictures. But I was determined that his mother, I was going to sit there.
The bloody crime scene photos were a crucial part of establishing the case against Ajelina.
It was pretty clear that it was a crime of passion.
However, the prosecution argued that while Ajelina was clearly in a pent-up emotional state when she stabbed her baby's father to death, the evidence suggested that Will wasn't.
He's laying flat on his back on the bed and has no awareness of what's going on.
In no condition to even fight back.
When it's been a fight or a brawl, is you tend to notice what we call defensive wounds.
In this case, there just weren't many, if any, of those kind of wounds.
However, Will did have one curious injury.
The wounds seem to sort of cluster around this particular tattoo.
Like someone tried to cut that tattoo out.
And based on what the tattoo was, the prosecutors argued that someone could only be Ajelina.
On Will's shoulder, he had a tattoo that had his daughter's name.
That just showed vengeance. I mean, you don't want your child's name on somebody's arm, so you're trying to remove it.
But would the jury believe the petite young woman sitting at the defense table was capable of such a brutal murder?
She looks like she could be your daughter on the church choir. She doesn't look like a murderer.
She's a little mousy looking. She wore glasses. She's very quiet.
And they would never know that she'd studied martial arts for years.
We thought that it should come in, and the judge kept it out.
They weren't allowed to mention that she was a black belt.
Which made it easy for the defense to argue that the police had made a mistake.
They lay the blame at the feet of the police for focusing too narrowly on Ajelina during the early stages of the investigation, saying that they failed to look for other suspects.
However, when the defense started laying out its case, They conceded that the prosecution was right about one thing, that Ajelina's involvement with drugs had led to William's murder, just not in the way the prosecutor had argued.
Their plan was to embrace all this bad stuff about their client, to use that to buttress an idea that maybe there is, in fact, this drug gang in Sierra Vista that's going around and killing people.
And according to the defense, once Ajelina was branded a snitch, she had become a target.
This violent drug guy who's sent in to kill her, or alternatively to kill Will, to show her that she needs to keep her mouth shut.
In almost any courtroom in America, it would have sounded ridiculous. But not in Sierra Vista, only a few miles from the battling drug cartels just across the Mexican border.
In Cochise County, Sierra Vista, we certainly have a large number of people who have been involved in the drug community. It was not a completely impossible theory of the events that she presented.
The defense had some evidence to back Ajelina up, too. First, there was her claim that someone had broken in and ransacked her apartment just days before Will's death.
There was a report called in to the sheriff's department.
Ajelina didn't take the stand to give the jury her firsthand account of the mysterious intruder. But the defense did call a forensics expert who testified that he'd found something in the crime scene photographs that the investigators had overlooked.
It's an impression on the floor in blood, and it looks like a large boot.
And according to the defense, the boot print in the blood couldn't be Ajelina's.
If it was a shoe, then it was a size 11 men's shoe.
Was it possible that there really had been an intruder?
The defense doesn't have to prove what happened. They only have to create the reasonable doubt.
There were times that he'd even make me rethink, well, could it have gone this way? Maybe she didn't do it.
And Ajelina's bizarre actions on the night of the murder and the problems with her story. According to the defense psychiatrist, those were easily understood.
She was just a scared young woman, and that explained this erratic behavior and inconsistent statements after that.
Perhaps, but under cross-examination, the prosecutor had just one question for the psychiatrist. In most murder cases, who are the victims killed by?
And he had to respond with the people we love.
And when the verdict came back, the jury agreed.
She was found guilty of first-degree murder.
The jury never really got away from just the real basic thing, which is who's most likely to have done this? And she was obviously, by far, most likely.
Ajelina was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. But then, just 2 months later, in October of 2011,
the original verdict was overturned.
There were some comments that were made by the prosecuting attorney during closing arguments that were interpreted as being unconstitutional.
Something along the lines of, there's only one person in this room who really knew what happened and she's not talking, suggesting that because she chose to remain silent, that she was obviously guilty.
Will's family was appalled.
I thought it was all, honestly, political BS. I really did.
But the judge's ruling meant Ajelina was headed back to court.
She was entitled to a new trial.
Coming up, Ajelina's defense tries a different strategy, and the new jury produces a very different result.
There really was not any evidence that she did it.
On September 8th, 2014, 24-year-old Ajelina Lewis stood trial a second time for the murder of Will Palmer.
The case had been overturned on appeal.
And all because, in his closing argument, the prosecutor said that Ajelina knew the truth, but wasn't talking.
And the judge ruled that was an improper constitutional violation of her Fifth Amendment right.
That the jury could have seen it as a comment on her not testifying.
Despite the setback, the prosecution's case in the second trial was identical to the first.
That she did it. There was no intruder.
And this time, The defense didn't really say otherwise.
In the second trial, in big contrast to the first, was they don't try to prove that there was another person.
And instead of pushing the idea that Will's death was some sort of drug hit,
their strategy was just pick apart the details of what we don't have. We don't have a murder weapon. We don't have a lot of things.
That there really was not any evidence substantial enough to prove that she did it.
Not that the jury necessarily agreed when they retired to consider their verdict.
The second jury knew she had done it.
But that was all they could agree on.
There was one gentleman who said, "I will not agree to first-degree murder."
There wasn't a whole lot of evidence to support her having thought much about her actions.
And without clear evidence of premeditation, the lone holdout refused to budge.
He said, "You can hang the jury, you can do whatever you want, I won't agree to it."
So after 5 tense hours of deliberation,
they found her guilty of second-degree murder.
Ajelina was sentenced to 16 years in prison, plus an additional 21 months for tampering with evidence by hiding her cell phone.
I thought she deserved the 25 to life. She took a life. She should give her life, whether it be in prison or they give her the death penalty.
Although for the police and prosecutors who put Ajelina in prison, that would have only added to the tragedy.
So many people, their lives were ruined by this.
A tragedy that could have easily been avoided in Ajelina's case.
Most of the people that we deal with are from very poor backgrounds, limited education in the family as a whole, don't have a lot of good choices that they can make in their life. And with Ajelina, it's the exact opposite.
In hospitals, death is an expected visitor. It arrives quietly, often after long battles against illness, age, or injury. Doctors prepare families for its possibility. Nurses comfort those left behind. Medical records reduce a lifetime into a final diagnosis, a final heartbeat, and a signature at the bottom of a death certificate. Because death is an unavoidable part of medicine, hospitals are built upon something even more important than technology or expertise. They're built upon trust. Patients surrender their bodies to strangers wearing uniforms. Families leave loved ones behind believing that every person who enters the room is working toward the same goal: to preserve life whenever possible and to ease suffering when life can no longer be saved. Few places demand greater faith in complete strangers. It is a trust that is rarely questioned, because questioning it would mean accepting an almost unimaginable possibility that someone inside the hospital could deliberately choose to end a patient's life. During the 1970s and 1980s, hospitals across Kentucky and Ohio experienced what appeared to be isolated tragedies. Elderly patients died after long illnesses. Some were seriously disabled. Others had complicated medical conditions that carried significant risks. Doctors signed death certificates listing natural causes. Families mourned, believing they had witnessed the inevitable conclusion of disease. Nurses comforted grieving relatives before preparing another room for another patient. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet behind this appearance of normality, an invisible pattern was quietly taking shape. Patients who seemed stable suddenly deteriorated. Individuals expected to recover unexpectedly died. Some who were reportedly preparing to leave the hospital never returned home. None of these deaths seemed connected. They occurred in different facilities over many years, under different physicians, and among patients whose medical histories appeared unrelated. There were no dramatic crime scenes, no shattered windows, no signs of forced entry, no obvious violence. Instead, each death blended seamlessly into the daily rhythm of hospital life, becoming another statistic in institutions where loss was unfortunately common. What investigators would eventually discover was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The deaths were not entirely random. They shared one quiet connection. A single hospital employee had been present again and again, moving through different institutions over nearly 17 years, while leaving behind a trail of unexplained fatalities. His name was Donald Harvey. Harvey was not a physician. He was not a surgeon performing complicated procedures or a respected specialist trusted with impossible diagnoses. He was a nurse's aide, a position often overlooked within the hierarchy of medical care. His responsibilities centered on assisting patients with daily needs, helping nurses, moving between rooms, delivering meals, providing basic care, and spending long hours with people who were often too weak to care for themselves. Because of this role, Harvey enjoyed something many others did not. He had frequent and sometimes unsupervised access to vulnerable patients. He could enter rooms without raising suspicion. He could remain beside bedsides while families stepped away for meals or brief moments of rest. His presence was ordinary, familiar, comforting even to patients and their relatives. He appeared to be one more caregiver among many dedicated professionals working exhausting shifts in difficult circumstances. Nothing about his appearance suggested that investigators would one day describe him as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. When authorities finally confronted Harvey in 1987, the investigation uncovered a scale of violence that challenged nearly every assumption about safety inside medical institutions. Harvey would ultimately be convicted of 37 murders committed over the course of his career. Yet during extensive questioning, he confessed to approximately 57 killings. That larger number has never been fully verified. Investigators have long distinguished between what could be proven in court and what Harvey himself claimed. Many potential victims had died years earlier. Medical records were incomplete. Bodies had already been buried. In numerous cases, enough physical evidence no longer existed to establish criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. As a result, 37 murders remain the legally established total, while the true number may never be known with certainty. Even so, whether the final count was 37 or 57, the implications remain staggering. Every confirmed victim represented someone who entered a hospital expecting care rather than violence. Every death carried families who believed disease had claimed someone they loved, never suspecting another human being had deliberately intervened. Harvey eventually acquired a nickname that has been applied to several medical serial killers throughout history: the Angel of Death. At first glance, the phrase almost sounds poetic, but there was nothing compassionate about the crimes associated with it. Harvey later described himself as a mercy killer, insisting that some patients had been suffering and that he merely helped them die peacefully. Investigators, prosecutors, and evidence gathered during the case painted a very different picture. Among the victims were patients who were recovering. Others were preparing to leave the hospital. Some were not terminally ill. These facts fundamentally contradicted Harvey's own explanation. His actions could not be understood simply as misguided compassion. According to investigators, Harvey later admitted that another motivation had emerged over time. He enjoyed deciding who lived and who died. That admission transformed the case from one involving claims of misplaced mercy into something far darker. The crimes were no longer viewed as isolated decisions concerning suffering patients. Instead, they revealed a pattern of deliberate control exercised over people who were physically incapable of defending themselves. One prosecutor would later summarize the case with a statement that became central to public understanding of Harvey's crimes. He wasn't helping people die peacefully. He killed because he liked killing. Those words reflected the prosecution's conclusion after examining victims who had shown signs of recovery and reviewing Harvey's own admissions. Yet long before anyone understood the full scope of the crimes, Harvey's actions had remained effectively invisible. The hospitals where he worked were not connected by sophisticated information-sharing systems. During the 1970s and much of the 1980s, institutions generally tracked their own patients rather than comparing mortality patterns across multiple facilities. A nurse's aide leaving one hospital for another rarely carried a detailed history that could reveal subtle statistical anomalies. If unexpected deaths followed Harvey from one workplace to the next, no centralized system existed to recognize the pattern. Within each hospital, the deaths often appeared explainable. Patients were elderly. Many suffered from serious illnesses. Natural deaths were unfortunately common. Without obvious signs of homicide, physicians frequently certified deaths as resulting from underlying medical conditions. Few autopsies were conducted for elderly or critically ill patients whose passing seemed medically plausible. The very environment designed to provide dignity at the end of life inadvertently created opportunities for concealment. Looking back decades later, investigators recognized that Harvey had exploited weaknesses that few people even realized existed. He reportedly used multiple methods over the years, including cyanide, arsenic, insulin, other toxic substances, oxygen deprivation, disconnecting life support, inducing infection, suffocation, and placing poison into food or drinks. The variety of methods made identifying a consistent pattern even more difficult. A death caused by poisoning might resemble sudden cardiac failure. Oxygen deprivation could appear consistent with severe respiratory disease. A vulnerable patient might deteriorate for reasons that seemed entirely medical. Harvey did not rely upon a single approach. According to the investigation, he adapted, changed methods, and continued moving through different healthcare facilities, leaving behind questions that would not be asked until years later. But every long investigation has a beginning, and every hidden pattern eventually encounters a moment that refuses to remain hidden. For Donald Harvey, that moment would arrive in 1987 after the death of a patient named John Powell. His passing initially appeared to be another tragic loss inside a hospital. Yet subtle details surrounding the death prompted closer examination. That examination would eventually expose one of the most disturbing betrayals of trust ever uncovered within the American healthcare system. Before investigators reached that turning point, however, there was another story that demanded attention, a much earlier chapter, one beginning far from hospital corridors, inside a modest household where a quiet boy grew up in poverty, carrying experiences that he would later describe as shaping the course of his life. Whether those experiences explained anything remains deeply contested. What is certain is that years before Donald Harvey became known as the Angel of Death, he was simply another young man searching for work, entering a profession dedicated to caring for the sick, while no one around him could possibly imagine the devastation that would follow. Donald Harvey entered the world on April 15, 1952, in Butler County, Ohio. But much of his upbringing unfolded within the poorer communities of Appalachian, Kentucky. It was a region where families often depended on hard physical labor, where opportunities could be limited, and where many children grew up learning resilience from an early age. Like countless others living in rural America during the 1950s and 1960s, Harvey's family was not wealthy. Their lives were shaped by modest means rather than comfort, and the future available to a young boy from such circumstances was often defined by whatever work could be found rather than by long-term ambition. Little in those early years suggested that Harvey would one day become associated with one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Yet the distance between ordinary beginnings and extraordinary crimes is often what makes certain cases so deeply unsettling. Unlike fictional villains whose violence appears inevitable from childhood, Donald Harvey's early life presents no clear roadmap toward the crimes for which he would later become infamous. Instead, investigators attempting to understand his past encountered fragments of information, many of them coming from Harvey himself years after his arrest. According to his own statements, he was frequently ill during childhood. Spending significant time sick can shape a young person's view of hospitals, caregivers, and vulnerability, but there is no evidence that these experiences alone predicted later violence. Harvey also claimed that he had been sexually abused by a relative during his youth. This allegation has frequently appeared in discussions of the case because Harvey himself raised it, repeatedly after his arrest. However, investigators and historians have also emphasized an important point. These claims were never independently verified. They remain part of Harvey's own account of his childhood, rather than an established historical fact. That distinction matters. In many notorious criminal cases, offenders attempt to explain or contextualize their actions by describing traumatic experiences from earlier in life. Sometimes those accounts are supported by evidence. Sometimes they cannot be confirmed. Responsible examination requires acknowledging what is known while avoiding conclusions that cannot be supported. Whether Harvey experienced exactly what he described remains uncertain. What is known is that he later presented those experiences as part of the story of how he viewed himself. Beyond those claims, Harvey was described as a quiet and socially isolated young man. He reportedly struggled to fit in comfortably with others and often kept to himself. There is nothing inherently sinister about introversion. Millions of people live private lives without harming anyone. Yet in Harvey's case, investigators would later note that his tendency toward isolation meant relatively few people possessed deep insight into his emotional world. He was not known for attracting attention. He did not cultivate a large circle of friends. Instead, he appeared to drift quietly through adolescence, avoiding notice rather than seeking it. At some point before completing a traditional educational path, Harvey left school. Like many young people facing limited economic opportunities, he entered the workforce early. In 1970, at approximately 18 years of age, he accepted a position as a nurse's aide at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. The decision itself seemed entirely ordinary. Hospitals required support staff willing to perform physically demanding tasks. Nurses' aides occupied an essential position within patient care, assisting professional nurses with daily responsibilities that often involve the most personal aspects of medical treatment. Their duties included helping patients eat, move, bathe, and remain comfortable during illnesses that sometimes left them completely dependent upon others. Unlike physicians or registered nurses, nurses' aides generally required less formal medical education, yet they often spent more direct time with patients than almost anyone else inside the hospital. This daily contact created relationships built on familiarity and trust. Patients recognized them. Families thanked them. Doctors depended upon them to communicate changes in a patient's condition. Few people questioned their presence because they represented the routine functioning of hospital life. For Harvey, this role offered constant access to individuals who were elderly, disabled, seriously ill, or recovering from medical crises. Every shift placed him beside people whose ability to protect themselves had been significantly reduced. Some could not leave their beds. Others relied entirely on caregivers for food, medication, and even breathing assistance. These realities did not make hospitals dangerous places in themselves. Rather, they reflected the profound trust required whenever illness removes a person's independence. Medical institutions function because patients believe those providing care will act in their best interests. Harvey entered an environment where that trust existed automatically. No one suspected that it might someday be exploited. During those first months at Marymount Hospital, Harvey appeared to settle into his responsibilities like any other employee. There were no public accusations suggesting that colleagues immediately viewed him as threatening. Nothing in the available record indicates that supervisors recognized the extraordinary danger standing among their staff. To everyone around him, he was simply another young worker beginning an adult career in healthcare. Looking backward after his arrest, that normal appearance became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Harvey did not fit popular stereotypes surrounding violent offenders. He did not hold immense authority within the hospital hierarchy. He was neither a celebrated physician nor a charismatic administrator capable of manipulating entire institutions. Instead, his position depended upon seeming ordinary. He blended naturally into the background of daily hospital operations, performing tasks that rarely attracted sustained attention. That invisibility would later become one of his greatest advantages. Modern readers may wonder why opportunities for oversight appeared so limited. The answer lies partly in the era itself. Hospitals during the early 1970s operated within systems very different from those familiar today. Electronic medical records did not connect institutions. Sophisticated statistical monitoring of employee-related mortality patterns had not yet become widespread. Communication between separate hospitals was often limited, particularly regarding support staff changing jobs. If an employee left one facility and found work elsewhere, there was little reason for administrators to suspect hidden patterns stretching across multiple workplaces. At the same time, death itself occupied a different place within hospital expectations. Medical science had advanced dramatically by the 1970s, yet many patients admitted to long-term care facilities remained extremely vulnerable. Elderly individuals with multiple illnesses sometimes deteriorated unexpectedly despite receiving appropriate treatment. Critically ill patients often experienced sudden complications. Physicians confronted mortality every day, making unexpected deaths tragic but not necessarily suspicious. When a patient died after a difficult illness, families understandably focused on grief rather than criminal investigation. Unless obvious evidence suggested foul play, natural explanations usually prevailed. Harvey would later describe recognizing this reality after the earliest stages of his employment. According to his own later statements, he came to believe that hospitals offered unique opportunities because deaths among seriously ill patients rarely attracted close scrutiny. It is important to remember that this understanding comes from Harvey's post-arrest confession, rather than contemporary observations made by co-workers. At the time, no one around him appears to have understood what he allegedly realized. They simply saw another employee carrying out routine duties within a demanding profession. Yet beneath that ordinary exterior, according to Harvey's later admissions, a dangerous shift in thinking had already begun. Whether driven by anger, curiosity, a desire for control, or motives that evolved over time, the boundaries separating caregiver from killer had not yet become visible to anyone else. The profession he had entered existed to preserve dignity, reduce suffering, and protect those least capable of protecting themselves. It was precisely those values that made betrayal so devastating once the truth emerged years later. Every patient Harvey encountered expected compassion. Every family believed that the people surrounding their loved ones shared a commitment to healing. None could imagine that among the caregivers moving quietly through hospital corridors stood someone who would later confess to turning trust into opportunity. Before investigators uncovered decades of hidden deaths, before prosecutors argued that Harvey enjoyed deciding who lived and who died, before courts imposed multiple life sentences, there was one moment that Harvey himself would identify as the beginning of everything. It involved an elderly stroke patient, a brief encounter during routine care, an impulsive act of violence, and a death that everyone believed had occurred naturally. According to Harvey's own confession, that single incident convinced him that killing inside a hospital could remain invisible. Whether viewed as the first step in a 17-year series of murders or as the moment an ordinary healthcare worker crossed an irreversible moral boundary, it would become one of the most significant events in the entire investigation. The next chapter of Donald Harvey's story begins not with a police officer or a courtroom, but with a hospital room where a vulnerable patient trusted the wrong caregiver, and where a death that appeared unremarkable would later be remembered as the opening act of one of America's most disturbing serial murder cases. Every criminal investigation has a moment investigators eventually identify as the point where everything began. Sometimes that moment is preserved through forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, or official documentation. In the case of Donald Harvey, however, The event believed to mark the beginning of his killing spree emerged only years later through Harvey's own confession. There were no detectives standing outside a hospital room, no crime scene photographs, no immediate suspicion. The first known murder attributed to Harvey was not recognized as a homicide when it occurred. Instead, it disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of hospital life, becoming another death among many seriously ill patients. According to Harvey, the incident took place in 1970 while he was working as a nurse's aide at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. The patient, whose identity has never become one of the widely recognized names associated with the case, was an elderly man recovering from a stroke. Like many stroke patients, he required extensive assistance with even the most basic daily activities. Eating, moving, and maintaining personal hygiene often depended entirely upon hospital staff. Such dependence created an unavoidable imbalance of power. A patient could only trust that every caregiver entering the room intended to provide help rather than harm. Harvey later described the encounter that he claimed changed the course of his life. While caring for the patient, the elderly man allegedly lost control of his bodily functions and smeared feces onto Harvey's face. Whether the patient fully understood what had happened is impossible to know. Severe strokes frequently impair awareness, communication, and physical control. For healthcare workers, such situations are unpleasant but not unusual. Caring for vulnerable patients often requires patience during moments that are physically and emotionally demanding. According to Harvey's own account, however, he reacted not with professional restraint, but with sudden anger. He admitted that he took a pillow and pressed it over the patient's face until the man stopped breathing. The act itself, as Harvey described it years later, was shockingly simple. There was no elaborate planning, no sophisticated poison, no carefully designed alibi. If his confession is accurate, the first killing resulted from a brief eruption of rage rather than a carefully calculated murder. Yet what happened afterward may have shaped everything that followed. The patient's death attracted no criminal investigation. Medical staff believed the elderly stroke victim had died from natural causes associated with his condition. There was no apparent reason to suspect otherwise. The man had already been gravely ill. His age and medical history made death medically plausible. No autopsy was ordered. No police officers questioned hospital employees. No one examined the possibility that a caregiver had intentionally caused the death. From the perspective of everyone else inside the hospital, another patient had simply lost his battle against illness. Looking back decades later, Harvey claimed that this experience fundamentally altered the way he viewed hospitals. According to his confession, he realized several things at once. Seriously ill patients often died without extensive post-mortem examinations. Elderly victims rarely underwent detailed forensic investigation unless unusual circumstances existed. Deaths inside hospitals were commonly attributed to disease rather than criminal acts. Most importantly, Harvey believed he had discovered that he could kill without being detected. Whether this realization occurred exactly as Harvey later described can never be independently verified. Nevertheless, investigators considered the confession significant because it offered an explanation for how a 17-year pattern of murder could begin. Rather than immediately fearing arrest after the first death, Harvey believed he had escaped unnoticed. That perceived success appears to have eliminated whatever hesitation may have existed before the first killing. In later interviews, Harvey repeatedly referred to this early incident as a turning point. What began, according to his own description, as an impulsive act gradually evolved into repeated acts of deliberate homicide. One unnoticed death became another, and then another. Over time, Harvey no longer relied upon suffocation alone. Instead, his methods diversified, making the pattern even more difficult to recognize. Before examining that escalation, however, it is important to understand why the first death failed to generate suspicion. Modern audiences often wonder how a homicide inside a hospital could remain completely undetected. The answer lies partly in the realities of medicine during that period. Hospitals routinely cared for patients whose conditions carried high risks of sudden deterioration. Elderly stroke victims could die unexpectedly despite appropriate treatment. Physicians based death certificates upon known medical conditions and less compelling evidence suggested an alternative cause. Without obvious trauma or unusual laboratory findings, there was little reason to assume foul play. In addition, hospitals during the early 1970s lacked many of the safeguards that later became standard. Patterns of patient mortality linked to individual employees were not routinely analyzed. Electronic databases capable of identifying unusual statistical trends did not exist. If one nurse's aide happened to be present during multiple patient deaths, the coincidence might never become apparent. Each death remained confined to its own medical chart rather than contributing to a larger institutional picture. Harvey would later move between several healthcare facilities, and this lack of communication between institutions became one of the factors investigators believed allowed his crimes to continue for years. The first death also illustrates a broader truth about trust inside healthcare settings. Patients surrender extraordinary control over their lives when admitted to hospitals. They accept medications prepared by strangers. They rely upon staff for food, water, oxygen, and essential medical equipment. Family members cannot remain at the bedside every minute of every day. Instead, they depend upon the integrity of caregivers. This trust is not optional. It is necessary for hospitals to function. The overwhelming majority of healthcare professionals honor that responsibility with compassion and professionalism. Donald Harvey's crimes stand out precisely because they represented such an extreme violation of those expectations. Investigators later concluded that Harvey exploited the ordinary assumptions surrounding patient care. A nurse's aide entering a patient's room raised no concern. Delivering food or medication appeared routine. Assisting with oxygen equipment seemed entirely appropriate. Every ordinary task created opportunities that Harvey would later admit using for criminal purposes. The apparent normality of his work concealed actions that, according to prosecutors, were anything but normal. Harvey's later explanations for his behavior also evolved over time. He would eventually describe himself as a mercy killer, claiming that many victims had been suffering and that he had merely ended their pain. Yet this justification becomes difficult to reconcile with the very first killing as Harvey himself described it. By his own account, the stroke patient was not killed to relieve unbearable suffering, but because Harvey became angry after an unpleasant encounter during routine care. That distinction would later become important to investigators. If Harvey's earliest admitted murder resulted from anger rather than compassion, then his later attempts to portray himself as someone motivated by mercy became far less convincing. Prosecutors would eventually point to this inconsistency when arguing that Harvey's crimes were driven by motives unrelated to relieving suffering. They also emphasized that many later victims were recovering or preparing for discharge, facts that further undermined Harvey's explanation. Yet none of those arguments existed in 1970. At that moment, the elderly patient's death disappeared into hospital records as an expected consequence of severe illness. His family, like countless others, almost certainly believed they had lost someone to natural causes. Doctors believed they had witnessed another unfortunate but understandable outcome. Coworkers completed their shifts and continued caring for other patients. Harvey alone, according to his later confession, knew something entirely different had happened inside that room. More importantly, he believed no one else would ever know. That confidence would become increasingly dangerous. The first killing did not remain an isolated incident. Instead, Harvey later admitted that it opened the door to years of escalating violence. As his confidence grew, so did his willingness to experiment with different methods of killing. Rather than relying solely on suffocation, he began using substances that could imitate natural medical complications, including cyanide, arsenic, insulin, and other toxic agents. He also admitted to causing deaths through oxygen deprivation, disconnecting life support equipment, inducing infection, and placing poison into food or drinks. By constantly changing his methods, Harvey made detection even more difficult. The victims were no longer linked by a single recognizable cause of death. Instead, they appeared to die from a wide range of medical complications consistent with serious illness. To physicians reviewing individual cases, each death could seem tragic but explainable. To Harvey, according to his later admissions, the hospital had become a place where opportunity existed behind every closed door. What had begun with one unnoticed death would gradually expand across multiple healthcare facilities over nearly 17 years, leaving behind a trail of victims whose families had no reason to suspect that their loved ones had not died naturally. Only many years later, after one particular death refused to fit the expected pattern, would investigators begin retracing those forgotten steps and discover that the first victim had never truly been the last. If Donald Harvey's confession is accurate, the death of the elderly stroke patient in 1970 was not the end of a terrible mistake. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for nearly 17 years. The most disturbing aspect of that pattern was not simply the number of people who died, but how ordinary those deaths appeared at the time. Hospitals are places where lives are saved every day, but they're also places where people die despite every effort made to help them. Elderly patients succumb to chronic illnesses. Individuals recovering from major surgery develop unexpected complications. Those with weakened immune systems can deteriorate rapidly even under constant medical supervision. Every physician, nurse, and caregiver understands this reality. Donald Harvey, according to investigators, understood it as well. The difference was that he allegedly learned how to exploit it. Over the years that followed his first admitted killing, Harvey worked in several healthcare facilities across Kentucky and Ohio. The institutions named during the investigation included Marymount Hospital, where his career began, Cardinal Hill Hospital, Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center. To most employers, Harvey appeared to be another healthcare worker changing jobs, something that was neither unusual nor suspicious. There was no centralized system capable of alerting administrators that unexplained patient deaths seemed to follow him from one institution to another. Each hospital viewed his employment only within its own walls. No one could easily compare mortality patterns across different facilities, and no one recognized that the same employee repeatedly appeared wherever clusters of unexplained deaths quietly accumulated. According to Harvey's later confessions, his methods also evolved dramatically. Rather than relying on a single technique that investigators might eventually recognize, he used multiple methods of killing. This constant variation made individual deaths appear unrelated and significantly complicated any possibility of identifying a common cause. Among the methods Harvey admitted using, cyanide became the most widely known. Cyanide is an extremely dangerous poison because it prevents the body's cells from using oxygen. Effectively, death can occur rapidly and without a specific reason to test for the substance. Poisoning may not be immediately obvious. Harvey admitted placing cyanide into food and drinks served to patients. According to his statements, substances such as coffee, gelatin, pudding, and other liquid or soft foods became delivery methods because they could be consumed without attracting attention. During the years in which Harvey committed these crimes, hospitals did not routinely test deceased patients for cyanide unless physicians already suspected poisoning. As a result, many deaths attributed to natural illness were never examined for toxic substances. Harvey also admitted using arsenic, another poison capable of producing symptoms that could resemble naturally occurring disease. Unlike cyanide, arsenic poisoning may develop more gradually depending on the amount administered. Harvey stated that he sometimes used smaller quantities over a period of time. Symptoms such as vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, and progressive organ failure could easily resemble complications already associated with severe illness, particularly among elderly patients. In busy hospital environments where many individuals were already medically fragile, these symptoms did not automatically suggest criminal behavior. Investigators later concluded that this overlap between poisoning symptoms and genuine medical conditions contributed to Harvey's ability to avoid suspicion for so many years. Another method Harvey confessed to involved insulin. Insulin is a life-saving medication for millions of people living with diabetes. But when administered to someone who does not require it, excessive insulin can cause dangerously low blood sugar. Severe hypoglycemia may lead to confusion, seizures, unconsciousness, cardiac arrest, and death if untreated. Harvey admitted that he sometimes exploited this medical reality because critically ill patients often experienced complex changes in their condition. Unexpected deterioration did not necessarily appear unusual, unless medical staff specifically investigated the possibility of insulin overdose. The true cause could remain hidden. Harvey also described causing deaths by depriving patients of oxygen. According to his confession, he sometimes disconnected oxygen supplies, interrupted life support equipment, or otherwise prevented patients from receiving the respiratory support upon which they depended. Again, these actions occurred within environments where patients were already seriously ill. Respiratory failure itself was often expected among individuals suffering from advanced disease. Consequently, distinguishing deliberate interference from natural decline could be extraordinarily difficult without direct observation or evidence. In some instances, Harvey admitted deliberately introducing infection. Patients weakened by illness are particularly vulnerable to bacteria and other infectious agents. Hospital-acquired infections represented a significant medical concern long before Harvey's crimes became public knowledge. According to his statements, he occasionally manipulated that vulnerability, contributing to illnesses that appeared to arise from natural complications rather than intentional acts. Harvey further acknowledged using suffocation in certain cases, echoing the method he claimed had been employed during the first killing. Finally, he admitted placing poisonous substances into food and beverages served directly to patients. Each method shared one critical characteristic. It could often imitate ordinary medical deterioration. Rather than producing dramatic crime scenes, these actions blended into conditions physicians encountered regularly. The diversity of Harvey's methods raises an important question. Why change techniques instead of relying on one approach? Harvey himself offered no single explanation that accounts for every decision, but investigators observed that varying methods reduce the likelihood of establishing a recognizable pattern. If every victim died from identical poisoning, toxicology testing might eventually reveal similarities. By contrast, deaths appearing to result from respiratory failure, infection, cardiac complications, or underlying disease created the illusion that unrelated medical problems were responsible. Whether intentional or instinctive, this variation contributed to the extraordinary difficulty investigators later faced when reconstructing Harvey's crimes. The victims themselves represented another reason the murders remained concealed for so long. Harvey primarily targeted elderly patients, individuals with disabilities, and people already receiving treatment for serious illnesses. Many required extensive assistance simply to complete daily activities. Their medical records already documented significant health problems. Consequently, sudden decline often appeared medically plausible even when foul play had occurred. However, the investigation would later establish that not every victim was approaching the end of life. Some patients were recovering. Others were reportedly preparing for discharge from the hospital. These facts became crucial because they directly contradicted Harvey's later attempts to portray himself as someone ending unbearable suffering. Prosecutors emphasized that patients expected to recover cannot reasonably be described as individuals requiring mercy killing. Their deaths represented interrupted recoveries rather than compassionate interventions. Another lesser-known aspect of the investigation broadened the scope of Harvey's crimes beyond Hospital walls. According to investigative findings and Harvey's own admissions, not every victim was a hospital patient. Some were acquaintances, neighbors, individuals with whom Harvey had personal relationships, or former romantic partners. In at least one instance described during the investigation, Harvey admitted using arsenic against someone he knew outside the healthcare setting following a personal conflict. This revelation significantly altered investigators' understanding of his behavior. If Harvey killed both patients and people from his private life, then the crimes could no longer be explained solely through access to terminal illness or hospital circumstances. Instead, the pattern suggested that healthcare simply provided convenient opportunities rather than defining the entire extent of his violence. Throughout these 17 years, one remarkable fact remained constant. Harvey continued moving through healthcare environments without attracting sustained criminal suspicion. Colleagues saw patients die, but hospitals inevitably witnessed death. Physicians signed death certificates based upon illnesses they believed adequately explained the outcomes before them. Families grieved without imagining that someone responsible for comforting their loved ones had instead caused their deaths. Looking back after Harvey's arrest, many investigators concluded that no single failure allowed the crimes to continue. Rather, numerous ordinary assumptions combined to create an environment where the possibility of homicide rarely entered anyone's mind. Hospitals trusted employees. Patients trusted caregivers. Deaths among medically fragile individuals rarely prompted extensive forensic investigation. Separate institutions failed to share information capable of revealing broader patterns. None of these circumstances alone created a serial killer. Together, however, they formed conditions that Harvey, according to prosecutors, exploited repeatedly over nearly 2 decades. Yet despite years of apparent invisibility, hidden patterns have a way of eventually revealing themselves. Every long series of crimes contains a moment when coincidence becomes too unlikely, when one death raises questions that previous deaths never did. For Donald Harvey, that turning point would arrive in 1987 at Drake Memorial Hospital. The death of one patient, John Powell, initially seemed no different from many others that had preceded it. But unlike the countless deaths that had quietly disappeared into hospital records over the previous 17 years, this case would not end with a routine death certificate. A careful examination would uncover evidence that could not be explained by natural disease, setting investigators on a path that would ultimately expose one of the most extensive murder confessions in American history and force hospitals across the country to confront a terrifying question they had never imagined asking. What if the danger had never been outside the hospital at all, but standing quietly beside the patient's bed? By the mid-1980s, Donald Harvey had spent years moving quietly through hospitals and healthcare facilities, leaving behind deaths that appeared unrelated to one another. To co-workers, he remained a nurse's aide carrying out routine responsibilities. To physicians, the patients who died under their care often seemed to have succumbed to illnesses that were already severe enough to threaten their lives. To grieving families, each loss was another painful reminder that medicine could not always overcome age, disease, or physical decline. Yet behind those ordinary explanations, according to Harvey's later confessions, dozens of deliberate killings had already taken place. During the investigation that followed his arrest, Harvey attempted to explain his actions with a phrase that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. He repeatedly described himself as a mercy killer. According to Harvey, many of the patients he targeted were suffering, and he believed he was helping them escape pain by ending their lives. The claim immediately drew public attention because it touched upon one of the most emotionally complex questions in medicine. How should society understand death when someone is already gravely ill? Harvey sought to frame himself not as a murderer driven by cruelty, but as someone who had performed what he considered acts of compassion. However, investigators quickly found that the evidence did not support this explanation. As detectives reviewed medical records, and compared Harvey's admissions with hospital documentation. A very different picture emerged. Among the people Harvey admitted killing were patients who were not in the final stages of life. Some were recovering from illness. Others had shown measurable improvement. According to the investigation, several patients were preparing to leave the hospital when their conditions suddenly and unexpectedly deteriorated. These were not individuals universally believed to be beyond medical help. Their deaths interrupted recoveries rather than ending prolonged and hopeless suffering. This distinction became one of the central issues in understanding Harvey's crimes. If his actions had truly been motivated by compassion alone, investigators argued, then the selection of victims would likely have reflected patients facing unavoidable and imminent death. Instead, the pattern included people whose futures still held realistic possibilities of recovery. Prosecutors therefore rejected Harvey's characterization of himself as someone performing acts of mercy. During the legal proceedings, they argued that the evidence demonstrated something fundamentally different. Harvey was not responding to unbearable suffering. He was exercising power over vulnerable individuals who trusted him. As the investigation continued, Harvey himself offered another explanation that further weakened his original claims. According to investigators, he eventually admitted that over time he had come to enjoy deciding who would live and who would die. That statement represented a profound shift from the image of a caregiver acting out of misguided compassion. The focus was no longer on relieving pain but on control. Hospitals naturally place enormous authority in the hands of medical professionals and support staff. Every patient depends upon caregivers for medication, nutrition, treatment, and countless other aspects of daily survival. Harvey's own admission suggested that he found satisfaction in possessing that extraordinary authority over life itself. Investigators believe this evolving motivation explained why the crimes continued for so many years, and why victims included people whose deaths could not reasonably be justified as compassionate interventions. Throughout the investigation, authorities avoided accepting Harvey's explanations at face value. Instead, they measured his statements against objective facts. Whenever a victim had been improving medically before suddenly dying, Harvey's narrative became increasingly difficult to defend. Every recovering patient contradicted the notion of mercy. Every individual preparing for discharge challenged the claim that death had been inevitable. The contrast between Harvey's words and the available evidence became one of the strongest arguments presented by prosecutors. One statement delivered during the case came to symbolize the prosecution's view of Harvey's motives. A prosecutor summarized the government's position with a sentence that has been quoted repeatedly in discussions of the case. He wasn't helping people die peacefully. He killed because he liked killing. Although brief, the statement reflected months of investigation and careful examination of Harvey's admissions. It did not rely solely upon emotion, but upon the pattern investigators believed they had uncovered. The victim's medical conditions, Harvey's own changing explanations, and the variety of circumstances surrounding the deaths all pointed away from compassion and toward intentional homicide. Harvey's methods also reinforced this conclusion. According to his confessions, he did not rely upon a single technique reserved only for terminally ill patients. Instead, he admitted using cyanide, arsenic, insulin, oxygen deprivation, disconnected life support equipment, induced infections, suffocation, and poison concealed within food or beverages. These methods required planning, opportunity, and repeated decisions rather than isolated emotional reactions. The diversity of techniques suggested a willingness to adapt rather than a desperate response to witnessing unbearable suffering. Investigators therefore concluded that Harvey's behavior demonstrated calculation over an extended period rather than spontaneous acts of misplaced sympathy. Another important aspect of the investigation concerned victims outside hospital settings. Harvey admitted that some people he killed were acquaintances, neighbors, or individuals from his personal life. This fact further complicated any attempt to portray the murders as acts connected exclusively to medical care. When violence extends beyond patients in hospital beds, the explanation of mercy becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. According to investigators, these additional victims illustrated that Harvey's behavior was not confined to situations involving end-of-life care. Instead, the pattern suggested motivations capable of extending into entirely different environments whenever Harvey chose to act. As investigators pieced together the timeline of nearly 17 years, they also recognized how Harvey's position had shielded him from suspicion. Nurses' aides occupy roles built upon close personal interaction with patients. Families often develop strong appreciation for individuals who assist loved ones with everyday needs. These caregivers help patients eat when they cannot feed themselves, provide comfort during painful recoveries, and remain present during long nights when relatives must finally go home. Harvey's crimes therefore represented not only physical violence, but also a profound betrayal of one of healthcare's most essential relationships. Patients welcomed him because they believed he had come to help. Families thanked him for kindness they believed was genuine. Hospitals trusted him with responsibilities involving people at their most vulnerable. That trust became the very mechanism investigators believed Harvey exploited. The psychological impact upon surviving families proved especially devastating once the truth emerged. Many had spent years believing natural illness had taken someone they loved. They had accepted physicians' explanations, mourned, and gradually attempted to rebuild their lives. Learning that a trusted caregiver might have intentionally caused those deaths forced families to revisit memories they believed had already found painful closure. Every final conversation, every bedside farewell, every assumption about what had happened suddenly became uncertain. Instead of remembering an unavoidable medical tragedy, they were confronted with the possibility that murder had hidden behind the appearance of compassionate care. Yet despite growing suspicions during the investigation, authorities still faced a difficult challenge. Harvey had admitted to numerous killings, but confessions alone could not automatically establish legal responsibility for every death. Many cases stretched back more than a decade. Some victims had already been buried for years. Medical records varied in completeness. Physical evidence had disappeared with time. Detectives therefore worked carefully to distinguish between what Harvey claimed and what could actually be verified through documentation, forensic examination, or other supporting evidence. This distinction would later explain why Harvey confessed to approximately 57 murders while ultimately being convicted of 37. The difference reflected the realities of criminal prosecution rather than an acceptance or rejection of every confession. As investigators continued reviewing hospital records and examining Harvey's statements, one particular death increasingly stood apart from all the others. Unlike earlier cases that had quietly passed without extensive examination, this patient received an autopsy that revealed something impossible to dismiss as ordinary disease. His name was John Powell. His death at Drake Memorial Hospital in 1987 would become the event that transformed years of hidden suspicion into a full criminal investigation. What initially appeared to be another tragic hospital death would instead expose evidence that forced detectives to ask a question no one had seriously considered before. If one patient's death had been caused deliberately, how many others had never been recognized? That single discovery would soon unravel nearly 2 decades of concealed violence, turning Donald Harvey from an obscure hospital employee into one of the most notorious healthcare serial killers in American history. For nearly 17 years, the deaths associated with Donald Harvey had blended almost seamlessly into the ordinary reality of hospital life. Elderly patients passed away after long illnesses. Individuals with complex medical conditions suffered unexpected complications. Physicians completed death certificates based on the information available to them, and families accepted heartbreaking losses as unfortunate but natural outcomes. If Harvey's later confessions were accurate, dozens of murders had already taken place without triggering a criminal investigation capable of exposing the pattern. That remarkable period of invisibility would come to an end in 1987 because of one patient whose death refused to fit comfortably within the expected narrative. His name was John Powell. Powell was being treated at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, one of the healthcare facilities where Harvey had worked as a nurse's aide. According to the information later reviewed by investigators, Powell's condition had shown signs of improvement, rather than appearing to enter the final stage of an irreversible illness. He was reportedly recovering. Family members had reason to believe that his health was moving in a positive direction. While every hospitalization carries uncertainty, there was no widespread expectation that death was immediately approaching. Then, without warning, Powell died. At first glance, the event resembled many other hospital deaths. Patients sometimes deteriorate unexpectedly despite encouraging progress. Infections can develop rapidly. Hidden complications may emerge with little notice. Experienced physicians understand that medicine can never eliminate every risk. Yet something about Powell's death caused concern. According to the investigation, members of his family questioned how someone who had appeared to be improving could suddenly lose his life. Their uneasiness did not immediately identify a killer, but it prompted closer attention than many previous deaths had received. That willingness to ask questions became one of the defining moments of the entire case. Instead of accepting the death certificate without further examination, an autopsy was performed. During the examination, the medical examiner encountered something profoundly unusual. A distinctive odor associated with cyanide was detected coming from Powell's stomach. Cyanide was not a substance physicians expected to discover in an ordinary hospital death. It was not a natural byproduct of disease, nor was it routinely associated with legitimate medical treatment. The observation immediately transformed what had appeared to be a medical tragedy into a potential homicide investigation. Detecting cyanide did not by itself answer every question. Investigators still needed laboratory testing to determine whether poisoning had actually occurred. According to the information provided in the investigation, subsequent testing confirmed the presence of cyanide in Powell's body. The implications were enormous. If cyanide had caused the patient's death, then someone had introduced a lethal poison into a hospital environment where patients were supposed to receive care rather than harm. The possibility that a hospital employee had deliberately poisoned a patient represented one of the most serious breaches of public trust imaginable. Detectives now faced a fundamentally different investigation from anything the hospital had previously encountered. Instead of asking why a patient had died from illness, they needed to determine who had the opportunity to administer poison. Investigators began reviewing everyone who had interacted with John Powell during the period leading up to his death. Physicians, nurses, support staff, and other employees all became part of the inquiry. Hospitals maintained detailed records regarding patient care, making it possible to identify personnel who had direct access to individual patients. As detectives reconstructed Powell's final hours, one name quickly drew increasing attention: Donald Harvey. Harvey had been among those with the opportunity to interact closely with Powell before his unexpected death. At that stage of the investigation, opportunity alone did not establish guilt. Hospitals function through teamwork, and many employees routinely come into contact with patients during the course of treatment. Nevertheless, investigators regarded Harvey as someone requiring careful examination because his role as a nurse's aide placed him in close proximity to vulnerable individuals on a daily basis. Detectives arranged to question him as part of the ongoing investigation. According to the available information, Harvey initially denied any involvement in Powell's death. Such a response was hardly unexpected. Most criminal investigations begin with suspects denying responsibility. Detectives therefore continued their questioning, carefully examining inconsistencies, reviewing evidence, and comparing Harvey's statements with the developing forensic findings. The interview extended over many hours. Investigators remained focused on the physical evidence pointing towards cyanide poisoning while attempting to understand how such a substance could have reached the patient. Then the investigation took a dramatic and unexpected turn. After prolonged questioning, Harvey abandoned his denial and confessed. His admission immediately changed the nature of the case. Detectives had entered the interview seeking answers regarding one suspicious death. Instead, Harvey began describing something far larger. According to investigators, he admitted responsibility not only for John Powell's murder, but also for numerous other killings committed over many years. At first, even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend the scale of what they were hearing. Serial murder investigations often require months or years of painstaking evidence gathering before patterns emerge. In Harvey's case, the suspect himself began describing a history of violence that extended far beyond the original investigation. What had started as an inquiry into a single suspicious death rapidly expanded into one of the largest homicide investigations involving a healthcare worker in American history. Harvey's confession forced investigators to reconsider years of seemingly natural hospital deaths. Every institution where he had worked suddenly became relevant. Every patient whose death had appeared medically explainable now required renewed attention. Detectives began examining employment records, hospital documentation, and historical case files in an effort to reconstruct Harvey's movements over nearly 2 decades. The challenge confronting investigators was extraordinary. Many of the deaths Harvey described had occurred years earlier. Some victims had already been buried for long periods. Medical documentation varied in detail from one hospital to another. Physical evidence that might have confirmed poisoning or other causes of death had often disappeared. With time, yet Harvey continued providing information that investigators considered remarkably specific. According to the investigation, he identified patients by name, remembered methods used to kill them, recalled approximate time frames, and described different poisons or techniques employed in individual cases. His detailed recollection surprised even seasoned investigators accustomed to interviewing violent offenders. Detectives compared Harvey's statements with surviving medical records wherever possible. In some cases, documentation supported aspects of his confessions. In others, the passage of time made independent verification impossible. Nevertheless, the consistency of Harvey's recollections convinced investigators that they were confronting far more than a fabricated story designed to attract attention. The investigation soon expanded beyond Drake Memorial Hospital. Harvey's previous employment at Marymount Hospital, Cardinal Hill Hospital, and the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center also came under scrutiny. Authorities searched for connections among deaths that had once appeared isolated but now seemed potentially linked by the presence of the same employee. The emerging pattern explained something that individual hospitals had never been able to recognize. Viewed separately, each institution had witnessed only a limited number of unexplained deaths. Viewed together, those deaths formed a much larger picture stretching across multiple facilities over nearly 17 years. The lack of communication between hospitals during the 1970s and early 1980s had prevented anyone from seeing that broader pattern until Harvey himself revealed it. For investigators, one of the most sobering realizations involved how close the truth had remained to disappearing forever. Had John Powell's death not prompted closer examination, the chain of murders might have continued even longer. The discovery of cyanide during the autopsy represented a rare intersection of circumstance, forensic observation, and persistent investigation. Without that single finding, Harvey's crimes could have remained hidden behind death certificates listing natural causes. Powell's death, therefore, became more than another tragic loss. It became the turning point that exposed years of concealed violence. As Harvey continued speaking with investigators, the number of admitted victims steadily increased. What began as one murder confession soon expanded beyond anything detectives had anticipated. Each additional admission forced authorities to reconsider another death, another family, another hospital room where trust may have been fatally betrayed. The investigation was no longer focused solely on proving that Harvey had poisoned John Powell. It had become an effort to determine how many lives had actually been taken, how many cases could still be verified after so many years, and how a single nurse's aide had managed to operate undetected across multiple healthcare institutions for nearly 2 decades. The answers Harvey would provide over the following days would astonish investigators, challenge prosecutors, and leave grieving families confronting a devastating possibility that the deaths they had accepted as natural tragedies had, in reality, been carefully concealed murders. Once Donald Harvey admitted responsibility for the death of John Powell, investigators found themselves confronting a situation unlike any they had anticipated. What had begun as a homicide investigation centered on a single suspicious hospital death rapidly expanded into an inquiry that stretched back nearly 17 years and crossed multiple healthcare institutions in 2 states. Every new interview with Harvey seemed to reveal another name, another hospital room, another patient whose death had once been accepted as a tragic consequence of illness, but now demanded renewed examination. Detectives understood that confessions alone could not automatically establish criminal responsibility. Every statement had to be compared against available evidence, medical records, employment histories, and, whenever possible, forensic findings. Even so, Harvey's willingness to continue talking fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. According to the information gathered during the case, Harvey did not stop after admitting one murder. During the early stages of questioning, he confessed to approximately 33 killings. For investigators, that number alone was almost unimaginable. Very few serial murder cases involve such a large number of admitted victims, particularly within hospitals where deaths frequently appear medically explainable. Yet the surprises were not over. As questioning continued over the following days, Harvey expanded his admissions even further. The total increased from 33 to 37. Detectives, prosecutors, and medical investigators now faced the enormous responsibility of determining which cases could actually be supported through evidence strong enough to withstand judicial scrutiny. Then Harvey made another astonishing claim. According to his own statements, the true number of people he had killed was closer to 57. That figure immediately became one of the most widely discussed aspects of the case. Investigators approached the claim cautiously. They recognized that offenders sometimes exaggerate their crimes for attention, while others minimize their actions. Harvey's confession therefore required careful verification rather than automatic acceptance. Throughout the investigation, authorities consistently distinguished between the number Harvey claimed and the number that could ultimately be established through legal proceedings. This distinction remains essential to understanding the case today. Harvey confessed to approximately 57 murders, but he was ultimately convicted of 37 because those were the cases supported by sufficient legal evidence or formal guilty pleas. The remaining admissions remain part of Harvey's own account, but many could not be conclusively verified because of missing records, unavailable physical evidence, or the passage of time. One characteristic of Harvey's confession deeply impressed investigators. Rather than offering vague or generalized statements, he reportedly remembered remarkable details about many of the victims. According to investigative records, Harvey identified patients by name, described the hospital where each death occurred, explained the method he claimed to have used, and often recalled why he had selected a particular individual. Detectives found themselves comparing his recollections against surviving medical documentation in an effort to determine whether independent evidence supported his claims. In several instances, investigators discovered information consistent with Harvey's descriptions. Medical histories aligned with patients he identified. Employment records confirmed that Harvey had indeed been working at the relevant facilities during the periods he described. Some forensic findings obtained through later examinations also supported portions of his confessions. These confirmations strengthened investigators' confidence that Harvey possessed firsthand knowledge. unavailable to someone inventing random stories. At the same time, detectives remained aware that many of the deaths dated back more than a decade. The passage of time created enormous practical obstacles. Numerous victims had already been buried for years. Some bodies could no longer provide useful forensic evidence, even if exhumed. Medical records from the 1970s were often incomplete compared with modern standards. Toxicology testing had not been routinely performed at the time many deaths originally occurred, because physicians had seen no reason to suspect homicide. As a result, opportunities to recover decisive evidence had disappeared long before anyone realized crimes might have occurred. These realities forced investigators into an extraordinarily difficult position. Harvey's admissions suggested a far greater number of victims than prosecutors could confidently prove before a jury. Criminal courts require evidence capable of establishing guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Suspicion, no matter how strong, is not enough. Even a confession may require corroboration depending upon the circumstances. Consequently, investigators carefully separated cases supported by substantial evidence from those resting primarily upon Harvey's own statements. This methodical approach reflected not uncertainty about the seriousness of the allegations, but respect for the legal standards governing criminal prosecutions. Throughout these interviews, Harvey also continued discussing his motives. He again referred to himself as a mercy killer, repeating the claim that many patients had been suffering and that he believed he was helping them die peacefully. Investigators compared these explanations with the evidence they had assembled. Once again, significant contradictions emerged. Medical records indicated that several victims had been improving rather than declining. Some had reportedly been preparing for discharge from the hospital before dying unexpectedly. These facts remained fundamentally inconsistent with Harvey's portrayal of compassionate intervention. Furthermore, Harvey's own admissions revealed motives extending well beyond claims of mercy. According to investigators, he acknowledged that his reasons for killing varied considerably. At different times, he described wanting control over life and death. He admitted becoming angry with certain patients. He spoke about conflicts involving family members of patients. He even acknowledged curiosity regarding the effectiveness of particular poisons. On other occasions, according to the investigation, Harvey reportedly suggested that he acted simply because he was in a bad mood. These shifting explanations painted a picture far removed from a single, consistent philosophy of ending suffering. Instead, they suggested behavior driven by changing impulses and personal desires rather than concern for patients' well-being. As detectives continued reviewing Harvey's employment history, another pattern became increasingly apparent. Wherever Harvey worked, unexplained patient deaths seemed to appear with unusual frequency. At the time those deaths occurred, however, each hospital had viewed them independently. Administrators at one institution possessed no practical way to compare mortality patterns with hospitals hundreds of miles away. Electronic databases capable of linking personnel histories across multiple employers did not exist. Consequently, Harvey's movement from Marymount Hospital to Cardinal Hill Hospital, then to Drake Memorial Hospital, and later to the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center, never triggered the broader statistical analysis that might occur in modern healthcare systems. Looking backward after Harvey's confession, investigators recognized that the absence of communication between hospitals had inadvertently allowed the pattern to remain hidden. No single institution observed the full 17-year timeline. Each facility witnessed only a fragment of the larger story. It was only after Harvey himself described his movements that detectives could reconstruct how the alleged killings stretched across multiple workplaces. For the families of victims, Harvey's confessions produced an emotional burden almost impossible to measure. Many relatives had already spent years believing disease had claimed loved ones despite the best efforts of doctors and nurses. Funerals had taken place. Grief had gradually settled into memory. Harvey's admissions suddenly reopened losses that families believed had already reached painful conclusions. Instead of asking why illness had taken someone they loved, They were forced to consider whether that person had actually been murdered by a trusted caregiver. In many cases, definitive answers remained impossible because evidence no longer existed. Some families would never know with complete certainty whether their loved one's death formed part of Harvey's admitted crimes. This uncertainty became one of the most heartbreaking consequences of the investigation. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they understood that presenting dozens of murders individually would require enormous time and resources while exposing victims' families to prolonged legal proceedings. Harvey, meanwhile, faced overwhelming evidence in numerous cases, as well as the possibility of the death penalty if convicted at trial. Under these circumstances, discussions regarding plea agreements became increasingly important. The legal process would ultimately focus not upon proving every confession individually, but upon securing convictions that ensured Harvey would never again have the opportunity to harm another patient. The decisions made during those negotiations would shape the final outcome of one of the largest healthcare serial murder cases in American history. Balancing the practical realities of prosecution against the desire to obtain justice for as many victims as the law could recognize. The scale of Donald Harvey's confession created an extraordinary legal challenge. By the time investigators had finished reviewing his statements, they were no longer dealing with a single homicide at Drake Memorial Hospital. They were examining a suspected 17-year pattern of killings that had allegedly taken place across several medical facilities in Kentucky and Ohio. The investigation had uncovered a disturbing reality: a person working within healthcare, someone whose role was supposed to involve assisting and protecting vulnerable patients, had admitted to causing the deaths of many people who depended on him for care. Yet despite the magnitude of the allegations, prosecutors faced the difficult task of transforming a massive criminal history into cases that could meet the strict standards of the courtroom. The difference between what investigators believed had happened and what prosecutors could legally prove became one of the defining issues of the case. Harvey's own admissions created a powerful foundation for the investigation, but the justice system required more than accusations, even when those accusations came from the person accused. Each murder charge needed supporting evidence. Prosecutors had to determine which deaths could be connected to Harvey through medical records, employment documentation, forensic findings, or other available information. The passage of time made this process extremely complicated. Many of the deaths Harvey described had occurred years earlier. Records from the 1970s and early 1980s were not as detailed as modern medical documentation. Some potential evidence no longer existed. In several cases, investigators could not establish enough proof to bring formal charges despite Harvey's claims. This explains why Harvey eventually admitted to approximately 57 murders, but was convicted of 37. The number reflected the difference between his own confession and the cases that could be supported. Through the legal process, the prosecution strategy focused on securing accountability for the victims whose deaths could be established rather than attempting to prove every allegation individually. For Harvey, the legal consequences were severe. Facing dozens of murder charges, he confronted the possibility of the harshest punishment available under the law. To avoid the risk of a death sentence, Harvey agreed to plead guilty to multiple murder charges. The agreement allowed prosecutors to secure convictions without requiring lengthy trials for every individual case, while Harvey avoided a potential capital punishment outcome. In Ohio, Harvey entered guilty pleas connected to numerous murders. Later, he also pleaded guilty in Kentucky for additional killings. The final result was a series of life sentences that ensured he would remain imprisoned and never return to society. The outcome reflected both the enormous number of victims involved and the practical difficulties of prosecuting a case spanning nearly 2 decades. During the court proceedings, prosecutors emphasized the unique nature of Harvey's crimes. This was not simply a case involving violence against strangers in public places. The victims were people inside medical institutions, individuals who were already vulnerable because of age, illness, or disability. Many had no ability to protect themselves. Some depended completely on caregivers for basic needs. The prosecution argued that Harvey had violated one of society's most fundamental expectations, that those entrusted with caring for the sick would act in their patients' best interests. Instead, according to prosecutors, Harvey transformed that trust into an opportunity to commit murder. The emotional impact of the case extended far beyond legal arguments. For families of the victims, the courtroom represented a painful attempt to understand something that seemed impossible to accept. Many relatives had originally believed that their loved ones died because of natural medical complications. They had trusted doctors' explanations and accepted the tragedies as unavoidable. Harvey's confession forced them to reconsider those memories. A final hospital visit that once represented a moment of farewell became something far more disturbing. The caregiver who had appeared to offer assistance may have been the person responsible for the death. This betrayal of trust became one of the most devastating aspects of the entire case. Prosecutors also challenged Harvey's repeated description of himself as a mercy killer. They argued that the evidence showed a pattern inconsistent with compassion. According to their presentation, many victims were not experiencing inevitable suffering at the end of life. Some were recovering. Some had realistic expectations of improvement. Their deaths could not be explained as acts intended to relieve unavoidable pain. Instead, prosecutors argued that Harvey's actions demonstrated a desire for control and the satisfaction of deciding whether another person lived or died. The phrase "angel of death" became associated with Harvey because of this disturbing contrast. The term is often used to describe offenders who kill within healthcare environments, exploiting the trust placed in medical workers. The label did not suggest kindness or protection. Instead, it reflected the horrifying reversal of the caregiver role. A person expected to represent safety and comfort became, according to the prosecution, a source of danger hidden within the very environment where patients sought healing. Beyond the courtroom, the case raised serious questions about healthcare oversight during the period in which Harvey committed his crimes. Investigators examined how someone could move between several medical facilities while allegedly leaving behind patterns of suspicious deaths. The answer was not a single failure, but a combination of circumstances. Hospitals at the time generally did not have systems designed to identify unusual mortality patterns associated with individual employees. Separate healthcare institutions did not routinely share information about staff members' histories. Medical deaths among elderly and seriously ill patients often received limited forensic examination because natural explanations appeared reasonable. These conditions allowed Harvey's alleged crimes to remain hidden for years. Following the case, healthcare organizations increased attention toward preventing similar situations. Institutions placed greater emphasis on background checks for employees reporting unusual deaths, monitoring access to dangerous substances, and improving communication between departments and facilities. The goal was not only to prevent intentional harm, but also to recognize warning signs that might otherwise be overlooked. The Harvey case demonstrated that protecting patients requires more than medical knowledge alone. It requires systems capable of identifying unusual patterns and questioning circumstances that do not fit expected outcomes. The convictions brought legal closure, but they could never fully resolve the uncertainty surrounding every person Harvey claimed to have killed. The families of confirmed victims received recognition through the criminal justice system, but families connected to unverified cases were left with unanswered questions. They knew that Harvey had admitted to many more killings than prosecutors could prove. They also understood that time had destroyed much of the evidence needed to determine the truth. This unresolved aspect remains one of the most painful elements of the case. Donald Harvey's story became one of the most infamous examples of a healthcare serial killer not because of a single dramatic event, but because of the length of time the alleged crimes continued unnoticed. Nearly 17 years passed between his first admitted murder and the investigation that exposed him. During that period, He continued working among patients, entering rooms, providing assistance, and appearing to fulfill the responsibilities expected of a caregiver. The contrast between his public role and his hidden actions created the foundation of the public shock that followed his arrest. Yet behind every statistic in the case were individual people. The focus of the investigation was not merely the number of victims, but the lives that were taken. Each person had a family, a history, and relationships that existed beyond the hospital room where they died. Their stories were often overshadowed by the size of Harvey's crimes, but they remained the central reason the case mattered. The tragedy was not only that one individual committed multiple murders. It was that dozens of people who entered hospitals seeking care instead became victims of someone who had access to their most vulnerable moments. After his convictions, Harvey spent the remainder of his life in prison. The legal system had achieved its primary objective, preventing him from harming others. However, the questions raised by his case continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. How could one person exploit a position of trust for so long? How many warning signs were missed? How can healthcare institutions ensure that compassion and trust remain protected from those who would abuse them? These questions became part of the lasting legacy of the Donald Harvey case. His crimes changed the way many people viewed patient safety and highlighted the importance of vigilance within healthcare environments. The story of the Angel of Death ultimately became not only a record of criminal acts, but also a reminder of the responsibility society carries toward those who are most dependent on others for protection. After Donald Harvey received multiple life sentences for the murders he admitted and was convicted of, the criminal investigation officially moved toward its conclusion. Yet the impact of the case did not disappear with the closing of the courtroom proceedings. The number of victims, the length of time the crimes continued, and the environment in which they occurred transformed Harvey's case into one of the most disturbing examples of a healthcare serial killer in American history. The legal system had answered one question: Donald Harvey would never again be free to harm another person. But many other questions remained. How had so many deaths occurred without detection? Why did the warning signs remain hidden for so long? And what could be done to ensure that patients would never again be placed in such a vulnerable position? These questions became central to the aftermath of the case. For the families of victims, the conclusion of the trial brought a complicated mixture of emotions. A conviction could provide a sense of justice, but it could not undo the damage caused by the loss of a loved one. Many families had spent years believing that their relatives had died from natural causes. They had mourned under the assumption that illness or medical complications had taken someone they cared about. Harvey's confession forced them to revisit those memories through a completely different and painful perspective. A hospital room that had once represented a final goodbye became associated with uncertainty and betrayal. The discovery that a caregiver may have intentionally caused those deaths created a second layer of grief. The families were not only grieving the loss of their loved ones, but also confronting the possibility that the circumstances surrounding those losses had been misunderstood for years. The victims of Donald Harvey were often overshadowed by the scale of his crimes. News reports and public discussions frequently focused on the number of murders, the methods he admitted using, and the shocking idea of a killer operating inside hospitals. However, behind every accusation and every statistic were individual human beings. They were patients who entered healthcare facilities expecting treatment, comfort, and protection. They were elderly individuals, people with serious illnesses, and vulnerable patients who depended on others because of their physical conditions. Their lives were reduced to case numbers during the investigation, but they had families, personal histories, and relationships that existed far beyond their medical records. One of the most troubling aspects of the Harvey case was the complete reversal of the caregiver relationship. Hospitals are built upon trust. When a patient enters a medical facility, they surrender a degree of independence because they need help. They allow healthcare workers to administer medication, provide assistance, monitor their condition, and perform tasks they cannot do themselves. This dependence is not a sign of weakness. It is a necessary part of receiving medical care. The entire healthcare system depends upon the belief that those given responsibility over patients will use that responsibility to protect life. According to investigators, Harvey violated that trust in the most extreme way possible. Instead of using his position to provide care, he used access and opportunity to cause harm. This betrayal became one of the reasons the case received such widespread attention. The public reaction to Harvey's crimes was shaped not only by the number of victims, but by the location where the crimes occurred. Many violent offenders operate in environments where victims and attackers have no relationship. Harvey's case was different. His victims were not random individuals encountered by chance. They were people who had entered hospitals seeking assistance. They were surrounded by medical professionals and family members who believed they were in a place designed to save lives. The idea that danger could exist within such an environment created a profound sense of fear and disbelief. Following the investigation, healthcare institutions examined the weaknesses that had allowed Harvey's crimes to continue for so long. The case revealed significant limitations in how hospitals monitored patient deaths and employee histories during the period when Harvey was active. At the time, hospitals generally did not have systems capable of analyzing whether an unusual number of deaths were connected to a particular employee. If a nurse's aide worked at one hospital and later moved to another, information about suspicious patterns or concerns often did not follow that person. Each facility operated largely within its own boundaries. As a result, the broader pattern remained invisible. The Harvey case contributed to greater awareness of the importance of communication and oversight. Within healthcare systems, medical institutions began placing increased emphasis on reviewing unusual deaths, improving reporting procedures, strengthening employee screening processes, and monitoring access to medications and dangerous substances. These changes were designed not because healthcare workers were generally viewed with suspicion, but because patient safety requires systems capable of detecting rare but devastating forms of misconduct. The lesson from Harvey's crimes was that trust alone is not enough. Trust must be supported by accountability, documentation, and careful oversight. Another major issue highlighted by the case was the importance of investigating unexpected deaths, even when the victim is elderly or seriously ill. Before Harvey was discovered, many patient deaths were considered medically understandable because the individuals already suffered from significant health problems. However, the investigation demonstrated that serious illness does not automatically eliminate the possibility of criminal activity. A person's medical condition may explain why death is possible, but it does not always explain why death occurred at a particular moment or under particular circumstances. The discovery of cyanide in John Powell's body became the critical reminder that unusual deaths require careful examination. Without that attention, the truth behind many other deaths might never have emerged. Despite the changes inspired by the case, the exact number of Harvey's victims remains uncertain. Harvey claimed responsibility for approximately 57 murders, but only 37 were established through convictions. This gap continues to create unanswered questions. Some investigators believed his statements contained information that was likely accurate but impossible to prove. Others recognized that criminal cases must rely on evidence rather than assumptions. The result is a permanent uncertainty surrounding some of the deaths Harvey described. For some families, that uncertainty meant never receiving complete answers about what happened to their loved ones. Donald Harvey remained imprisoned after his convictions, serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of release. The justice system had removed him from society permanently, but his case continued to be studied by investigators, criminologists, and healthcare professionals. He became an example of the challenges involved in identifying offenders who operate within trusted institutions. Unlike many serial killers who leave obvious crime scenes, Harvey's alleged crimes were hidden behind medical explanations. His environment provided access, his victims were vulnerable, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths often appeared ordinary. This combination allowed the crimes to continue for years. On March 28, 2017, Harvey was attacked by another prisoner while incarcerated in an Ohio prison. 2 days later, on March 30, 2017, he died at the age of 64 from injuries suffered during the assault. Authorities confirmed that his death resulted from the attack, although the full motive of the other prisoner was not publicly detailed. Harvey's death ended the life of the man responsible for one of the largest healthcare murder cases in American history. However, it did not erase the suffering of those affected by his crimes. The story of Donald Harvey remains a warning about the importance of protecting vulnerable people and recognizing that extraordinary crimes can sometimes occur in the most unexpected places. The hospitals where Harvey worked were supposed to represent healing, safety, and hope. Instead, according to investigators, they became the setting for years of hidden violence. The lasting lesson of the case is not only about one individual's actions, but about the responsibility of institutions to protect those who place their lives in the hands of others. Patients enter hospitals at moments when they are most vulnerable. They trust caregivers because they have no alternative. That trust is one of the foundations of medicine, and the crimes of Donald Harvey demonstrated the devastating consequences when that trust is abused. His name remains associated with the phrase angel of death. But behind that label are the lives of the people who were lost, the families who suffered, and the ongoing commitment to ensuring that healthcare remains a place of healing rather than harm. The case of Donald Harvey remains one of the most disturbing examples of a serial killer operating within a healthcare environment. Unlike criminals whose actions are immediately visible through violence committed in public places, Harvey's alleged crimes remained hidden behind the ordinary routines of hospitals. His victims did not disappear from their homes or become the subjects of immediate searches. Instead, their deaths were recorded within medical systems where illness, age, and physical decline already provided explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. The tragedy of the Harvey case lies not only in the number of people he admitted killing, but also in the fact that many victims were surrounded by professionals, family members, and institutions that believed they were receiving care. The story became a reminder that even environments created to protect life must maintain constant vigilance. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in Butler County, Ohio. He grew up in a poor working-class environment in the Appalachian region of Kentucky. According to Harvey's own statements, his childhood included experiences of illness, isolation, and alleged abuse by a relative. These details came primarily from Harvey himself and were not independently verified in every aspect. Experts examining the case suggested that difficult childhood experiences may have contributed to the development of his personality and behavior. But they also emphasized that such experiences do not explain or excuse the deliberate choices he later made. The responsibility for his crimes remained his alone. After leaving school early, Harvey entered the healthcare field as a young man. At 18 years old, he obtained work as a nurse's aide at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. The position did not require the same level of education as a licensed nurse or physician, but it placed Harvey in direct contact with patients. He assisted individuals who were elderly, disabled, or seriously ill. He entered hospital rooms, helped with daily needs, and became part of the routine environment surrounding vulnerable people. According to his later confession, this access provided the opportunity he would eventually exploit. The first murder Harvey admitted occurred in 1970. The victim was an elderly stroke patient. According to Harvey's account, the incident began with an unpleasant interaction during routine care. The patient allegedly lost control of his bodily functions and soiled Harvey. In response, Harvey admitted that he became angry and used a pillow to suffocate the patient. The death was not investigated as a homicide. The patient was already severely ill, and the circumstances appeared consistent with a natural medical decline. No investigation uncovered Harvey's actions at the time. According to his confession, this lack of suspicion became a turning point. He realized that deaths among seriously ill hospital patients could easily be accepted as natural. That belief, investigators later argued, created the foundation for a pattern of violence that continued for years. Over the next 17 years, Harvey worked in several medical facilities, including Marymount Hospital, Cardinal Hill Hospital, Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center. During this period, he admitted killing numerous patients. His methods varied widely, which made the deaths appear unrelated. According to his confession, he used cyanide, arsenic, insulin, oxygen deprivation, disconnected life support equipment, induced infections, suffocation, and poison placed in a food or drinks. The variety of methods prevented investigators from immediately identifying a single pattern. Each death appeared to have its own medical explanation. Some patients were elderly. Some suffered from serious conditions. Many circumstances surrounding their deaths did not immediately appear unusual. Harvey later described himself as a mercy killer, claiming he ended the lives of patients who were suffering. However, investigators rejected this explanation. They found that many victims were not necessarily at the end of life. Some were recovering. Some had shown signs of improvement. Others were reportedly preparing to leave the hospital before their sudden deaths. Prosecutors argued that these facts contradicted the idea that Harvey acted out of compassion. Instead, they believed his actions were driven by control and the desire to decide whether another person would live or die. The investigation that exposed Harvey began with the death of John Powell at Drake Memorial Hospital. In 1987, unlike many previous deaths associated with Harvey, Powell's death prompted further examination. According to investigators, Powell's condition had been improving, making his sudden death concerning to those close to him. During the autopsy, the medical examiner detected signs suggesting cyanide poisoning. Further testing confirmed the presence of cyanide in Powell's body. This discovery transformed the case from a medical death investigation into a homicide investigation. Authorities began examining everyone who had contact with Powell before his death. Harvey quickly became a person of interest because he had access to the patient during the relevant period. After initially denying involvement, Harvey was questioned for many hours. Eventually, he confessed. What investigators expected to be an investigation into one murder became the discovery of a much larger series of alleged crimes. Harvey first admitted to 33 killings. Later, that number increased to 37. Eventually, he claimed responsibility for approximately 57 deaths. Investigators were shocked not only by the number, but also by the detail contained in his statements. Harvey reportedly remembered victims' names, locations, methods used, and approximate circumstances surrounding many deaths. Detectives compared his statements with available records to determine which cases could be confirmed. The difference between Harvey's claimed number of victims and the number for which he was convicted reflected the challenges created by time and missing evidence. Some deaths occurred many years earlier. Some records were incomplete. Some cases lacked sufficient proof for prosecution. Ultimately, Harvey was convicted of 37 murders, facing the possibility of the death penalty. He agreed to plead guilty rather than proceed through lengthy trials for every case. He received multiple life sentences, ensuring that he would never be released. The convictions provided legal accountability, but they could not answer every question raised by the investigation. The families of possible victims were left with the painful reality that some deaths could never be fully confirmed. For them, Harvey's confession brought both answers and uncertainty. They learned that their loved ones might have been victims of deliberate acts, but they also faced the possibility that the complete truth would remain unknown forever. The case changed discussions about patient safety and healthcare oversight in the United States. It demonstrated the importance of examining unusual patterns of death, improving communication between medical institutions, and strengthening procedures related to employees, medications, and dangerous substances. The lesson was not that healthcare workers should be viewed with suspicion, because the overwhelming majority dedicate their lives to helping others. Instead, the case showed that even trusted systems require safeguards because rare acts of misconduct can have devastating consequences when warning signs are ignored. Donald Harvey's crimes became a defining example of the angel of death phenomenon, a term used for individuals who kill within healthcare settings. His case remains significant because it combines several deeply disturbing elements: a large number of victims, a long period of criminal activity, and the exploitation of a position built upon trust. But beyond the shocking details of the investigation, the most important part of the story remains the victims themselves. They were people who entered hospitals expecting care and protection. They were family members, friends, and individuals with lives that extended far beyond their medical conditions. Their deaths were not merely statistics in a criminal case. They represented personal tragedies experienced by people who trusted the healthcare system. Donald Harvey died on March 30th, 2017, at the age of 64 after being attacked by another prisoner in an Ohio prison. The attack occurred on March 28th, and Harvey died 2 days later from injuries sustained during the assault. His death ended the life of the man whose crimes had shocked the nation, but it did not end the importance of remembering what happened. The legacy of the case is not the notoriety of the offender. It is the reminder that vulnerable people require protection, that trust must be supported by accountability, and that every patient deserves the basic expectation that the person standing beside their hospital bed is there to help them survive. The story of Donald Harvey remains a dark chapter in American criminal history, but its most lasting message belongs not to the person who caused the harm. It belongs to the victims, their families, and the continuing effort to ensure that places dedicated to healing remain worthy of the trust placed in them.